And so this is a webinar that's part of a monthly series of the Geohealth Early Career webinar. And today we're really excited to have our speaker, Dr. Amanda Hoffman Hall from the University of Maryland Department of Geographical Sciences, and she is a health geographer. She is also the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the department, and she earned her PhD from the University of Maryland Department of Geographical Sciences in 2020. Her research, which you will see in detail today, focuses on geohealth and specifically algorithm development for satellite mapping of land cover, land use change, spatial epidemiology, and prediction of infectious disease risk, and population and human settlement mapping. In addition to all that, if it wasn't enough, she's passionate about undergraduate education, the power of Earth observations, and the global elimination of malaria. And so with that, we will get started. Just for a few housekeeping items, I just want to explicitly state that this webinar is being recorded or will be recorded in just a few minutes, just so everyone is aware, and will likely be shared through AGU as well in a different format. So just want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded. We will start with a presentation from Dr. Amanda Hoffman Hall before going into a moderated Q&A session. If you have questions, please find the participant in the chat whose name is Ask Questions Here. And then your questions will be filtered and categorized, and we'll get through as many as you will. And your audio and your video should be turned off by default. So if you can, if your audio or video is on, please turn it off just to save bandwidth. And so with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Hoffman Hall.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Allison. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. Thank you guys all so much for coming. The title of my talk that I'm going to give today is Fighting Malaria Through Geospatial Data Fusion. But before I get into that, I just briefly wanted to introduce myself. I won't reiterate the things that Allison already said in my introduction. Yeah, basically, I earned my PhD from the University of Maryland nearly a year ago now, 2 months into the COVID-19 lockdown in May 2020. My two littlest co-authors that I have pictured here miraculously didn't interrupt my Zoom defense, but then they were really confused while we were dressing up on a random weekday to take pictures in the backyard. But before I moved to Maryland, I earned my bachelor's degree in geography from the University of Oklahoma. And I like to tell people that I consider myself to be a health geographer and a remote sensing scientist. Now, geography, I refer to myself as a geographer because geography is sometimes called the original interdisciplinary science. And throughout my education, I really found this to be true. Because I'm a geographer, I've been able to work on a really wide range of projects, everything from collecting tree height data across the state of Maryland for use in garbage storage models, to investigating socioeconomic drivers of the logging industry in Russia, to studying right now how Gen Z undergraduates perceive old-timey versus new age science terminology, I used to also study the economic impacts of the Okie Noodling Festival in the small town of Pauls Valley, Oklahoma. If you've never heard of noodling, it's actually the sport and art of catching gigantic catfish with your bare hands. And unfortunately, that's not what I'm going to talk about today. But as someone who really values interdisciplinary science, I'm really looking forward to sharing my work on malaria with you guys, which pulls from various disciplines and fuses together multiple levels of disparate data. So the last thing before I jump into my official talk is my co-chair would surely be bummed if I didn't mention that I'm also the co-chair of the Geohealth Diversity Committee, and we are always looking for new members that might be interested in joining us. So if you are interested in joining our fairly new committee, please feel free to reach out to me via my email, which is right there, or find me on my Twitter account. So with that, let's get started. So malaria is a life-threatening disease that's caused by parasites, which are transmitted to people through the bites of infected mosquitoes. It is both preventable and curable. Yet in 2019, there were an estimated 229 million cases of malaria and over 400,000 deaths. Today, nearly half the world's population is still at risk of malaria. I just want to double check. You guys can see my slides, right? I forgot to ask about that. Hopefully you guys are seeing the same thing that I'm seeing. Thank you so much. Okay, the elimination of malaria is a top global priority, which was articulated in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals #3, which aims to end the epidemics of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria and other neglected tropical diseases. So the World Health Organization has its own very ambitious goals for malaria elimination, starting with a 40% reduction in malaria cases by the year 2020, which we are unfortunately past. Unfortunately, in the most recent 2020 World Malaria Report, the WHO states that despite remarkable progress, the global gains in combating malaria have leveled off in recent years, and many high-burden countries have been losing ground. As of the time of this report, global mortality rates had only fallen 18%, and incidence rates had only fallen 3%, well below the stated targets of 40%. The WHO contributes this to both insufficient funding and, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Funding deficiencies have resulted in gaps in access to proven WHO-recommended malaria control tools. And in 2020, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic emerged as a serious additional challenge to malaria responses worldwide. In this current context, the effective use of limited resources will be critical to achieving a measurable impact against malaria. Local data and intelligence are vital to inform locally tailored solutions. Therefore, the WHO recently shifted its priorities to a new aggressive plan titled High Burden to High Impact, a Targeted Malaria Response. One key element of this new plan is moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach and instead using data-driven methodologies to pinpoint where to deploy the most effective malaria control tools for maximum impact. Where some of this impact has been felt the strongest is within the greater Mekong subregion, where malaria cases have been falling dramatically. In particular, the country of Myanmar has been a success story, with a decrease of 82% of malaria cases in the country since 2012. For Myanmar, this is really exciting. They're very close to eliminating malaria within the country. However, now that Myanmar is classified as an area with low malaria transmission, significant challenges arise to driving out those last few remaining malaria hotspots. When nearly the entire country was at risk for contracting malaria, blanket measures such as give every human being a bed net were really effective at reducing malaria. Now, however, this remaining malaria reservoir is extremely heterogeneous and complex, and it makes these reservoirs extremely difficult to identify. Additionally, the country is facing numerous challenges which could inhibit its forward progress, including drug-resistant parasites, pesticide-resistant mosquitoes, and lengthy borders with other malarious countries. And by far, the biggest challenge of all is the current political, social, and economic climate within Myanmar. This is actually a screenshot that I took from Google News just yesterday. The current situation within this country is upsetting, it's intense, and it's really complex. The research that I'm going to be sharing as part of my talk today is centered in a small remote region of Myanmar. The field components that I'll talk about were conducted in 2016 and 2018 in collaboration with a stellar group of Myanmar scientists and government researchers. Unfortunately, the relationship between my team here in Maryland and our Myanmar collaborators has broken down, but we are hopeful that we will be able to work together again soon. And if that wasn't enough to add one more challenge onto the pile of challenges we're talking about now, this one in particular is something that we have all become far too acquainted with recently. As we meet here on Zoom today due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we're all now well aware of the extreme challenge in diagnosing, treating, and preventing diseases which sometimes don't present symptoms. While social malaria worker initiatives, like what I'm showing on the left, have been wildly successful in Myanmar, villagers only seek out these social workers when they are experiencing malaria symptoms. Much of the remaining malaria reservoirs in Myanmar are asymptomatic, and while they are still very capable of transmitting parasites via mosquitoes, most people that have this asymptomatic malaria are not aware of it. The ability to predict likely hotspots of these silent infections is still necessary, though, to effectively target those few remaining malaria reservoirs. Spatial statistical modeling has been deployed in multiple countries for malaria forecasting. Models that predict malaria risk based on mosquito densities have proven to be really useful, but previous studies have shown that models which rely solely on mosquito habitat are only loosely associated with actual malaria prevalence, while models which incorporate factors relating to human behavior alongside the vector densities tend to align better with observed malaria. And actually, if you were at the last Geohealth webinar, the president of our section, Dr. Benjamin Zaitchik, and his colleague, Dr. William Pan, actually presented the work that they've been doing regarding malaria in the Amazon region. One of the things that Dr. Zaitchik notes in this NASA feature that I screenshot here is how important it is to think about human movement and where humans interact with mosquitoes when thinking about malaria risk. I think I saw him show up on the participants list earlier. So thank you for being here and for this awesome video that you have. So my research over the past few years has focused on human behaviors related to malaria for a remote isolated township within Myanmar. A township in Myanmar is most similar to kind of like a county boundary here in the United States. An Township is a subtropical region along the western edge of Myanmar in Rakhine State. Much of the populace experiences extreme poverty, and traveling to medical care presents a challenge for many of them. The climate of An is hot in the summer, a little bit less hot in the winter, and the rest of the year it rains constantly. Climatologically, it is a mosquito paradise. The dominant mosquito control then is land cover. The two primary mosquito species in this area prefer different land covers. Anopheles dirus is primarily found in forested landscapes, while Anopheles minimus prefers foothills and valleys. While we have some vague idea of where the mosquito lives, I originally thought we'd have a much better idea, at least of where the people in An Township lived. Unfortunately, we didn't. Existing data sets showed very little agreement, and they were not available at spatial resolutions fine enough for my needs. The country did conduct a census in 2014, but due to political unrest at the time, this particular state is estimated to have undercounted its population during the census by over 1 million people, which is roughly 1/3 of the estimated state population. So I decided to make my own population map. I published this method that I'm about to describe in the journal Remote Sensing of Environment last year. The goal here was to create a map using moderate spatial resolution data that was all freely available to the public. The data on the left is an example of what I was using, which comes from the NASA Landsat program, while the data on the right is finer resolution that shows the villages that I was actually trying to locate. So there's probably, I know for a fact that there are a bunch of remote sensing scientists in the room today. But just in case you're not, I wanted to give a brief sort of overview of what we typically do. So what a remote sensing scientist will typically do is analyze the spectral signature of each pixel within an image to see if it can be sorted into a category, such as settlement, forest, or water. If you don't remember anything about the electromagnetic spectrum from your last physics class, that's totally okay. Essentially, what I'm showing here in this graph is different types of land covers reflect different wavelengths of light in different amounts. For example, you can see here that vegetation reflects really highly in the near infrared section of the electromagnetic spectrum, while water, on the other hand, basically doesn't reflect any near infrared light at all. So as you can imagine, objects such as metal roofs, they'll reflect differently than, say, a forest canopy, which means that we should be able to spectrally parse out settlements quite easily. Unfortunately, this isn't as simple as it sounds. The image on your left shows the individual pixels of a Landsat image compared to the same area shown with very high resolution imagery on the right. Each Landsat reflectance value comes from a pixel that equates to 30 meters by 30 meters on the ground. This means that the spectral curve that we get is a mix of multiple different land covers. Instead of receiving a beautiful vegetation spectral curve, you're left with a curve that's an amalgam of some trees, some grass, and some houses. So you might be then thinking to yourself, why then did you choose to use Landsat when the data like what you have on the right is available? Well, with current remote sensing technology, there always exists trade-offs. Imagery like what you see on the right tends to be very expensive to collect, whereas Landsat is currently free for public use. With the imagery on the right, since it is so expensive, you're usually only able to get a few images per year of the same area, whereas Landsat returns to the same location every 16 days. Also, most high-resolution satellite imagery only includes 4 portions of the electromagnetic spectrum, whereas Landsat captures 11 portions of the spectrum, which makes your curves a lot, able to differentiate between your curves a lot better. So then clearly distinguishing settlements from non-settlement pixels through only spectral signals was not going to work for me. What became important then was thinking of other remotely sensed and geospatial data that I could use to help distinguish between the pixels. I first added indices derived from combinations of spectral bands, such as the normalized difference vegetation index. For any non-remote sensors in the room, this helped me basically distinguish between pixels with high amounts of vegetation versus low, which were then more likely to contain settlements. Next, I tried to think more like a geographer or perhaps an anthropologist. Places in which humans settle tend to share similar characteristics. For example, many settlements, especially in On, are found near water. Furthermore, humans tend to settle on gentle slopes and at low elevations. However, what really aided in the distinguishing of pixels in On was identifying a unique characteristic of human activity within the township. During my team's field trips to On, we noticed that slash and burn agriculture is still heavily practiced in the area. This was a really key finding because the natural ecology of On Township doesn't support fires. Therefore, any fire that was detected in the area was likely caused by humans. So I included 2 other remotely sensed free data sets into my suite of layers, the MODIS active fire detections data set and the VIIRS active fire detections data set. All in all, I ended up with 84 different data layers that were each linked to human activity and On in some way. Each layer was derived from data that's freely available for public use, and they were all at 30-meter spatial resolution or coarser than that. As a note, what I'm showing in this figure is very high resolution imagery for display purposes, but as a reminder, the actual data that I was using for the model looked more like this. These 84 layers were put into a random forest machine learning algorithm, which ultimately assigned each 30-meter pixel a value representing the likelihood of it containing a settlement. After conducting an accuracy assessment, I decided that the best cutoff value was 65% likelihood of settlement presence, which created a binary map that looks like this. So by combining moderate resolution satellite imagery with metrics like distance to a recent fire and other publicly available data sensitive to human activity patterns, I was able to map rural settlements with a classification accuracy of 93.1%. It was overall revealed that the population of On Township is far more dispersed and isolated than had previously been mapped before. So now that I know where the people in On are, seem like a good place to start, I next wanted to identify the subgroups of this population that are most at risk of malaria. An example of human behavior that's associated with malaria is how people live, work, and move through their landscape. For example, previous research has shown that logging workers along the Thai-Myanmar border were at an increased risk of contracting malaria. Satellite Earth observations offer a cost-effective way to quantify landscapes through land cover mapping. The caveat to this, though, is that land cover does not always equal land use. A forest is an example of land cover, while logging would be an example of a land use that is associated with that type of cover. However, land cover maps can be contextualized to land use when they're combined with things like surveys or local knowledge. The work I'm about to share was recently published in the AGU's Geohealth journal. I had a really great reviewing experience with them, by the way. So if you're looking for somewhere to submit your next paper, definitely consider the Geohealth journal. So for this work, I sought to combine satellite Earth observations with qualitative field surveys. To do this, I used data that was collected by the Duke Global Health Institute and Myanmar's Department of Medical Research in 2016. Within their data, they had blood samples and surveys from roughly 200 participants each from 5 villages across On Township. The blood samples were diagnosed using ultrasensitive reaction methods, which can detect much lower levels of parasites than the more common testing mechanisms. This meant that the data was able to include asymptomatic participants. They also collected demographics, symptom information, and asked about their land use habits. Specifically, they asked, do you go to any of these places frequently? Plantations, farms, forested areas, mines, or refugee camps? For the sake of time today, I'm only going to focus on farms and forested areas. Within the study population, there were 92 cases of malaria, which is a little less than 10% of the sample population. All of the malaria cases, except for one, were wholly asymptomatic. So 91 of these people were completely unaware that they had malaria parasites in their blood at the time. How villagers responded to the land use questions also varied quite a bit. Villages A, B, and C reported a lot of farming, for example, while villages D and E did not. Most interesting, though, is that almost 50% of our sample didn't select any of the land use options that we gave them at all. While the field surveys provided that subjective land use data, I used satellite remote sensing to obtain a more objective view of the landscape and compare that to the field survey. My team here at University of Maryland created a 30-meter spatial resolution land cover map for all of Myanmar by fusing data layers that we produced using machine learning algorithms with existing remotely sensed data sets. This map is actually a publicly, the 30-meter land cover map of Myanmar is actually publicly available via the Pangea repository if you're working in this area and interested in using it. I then quantified the area of each land cover type within a 2-kilometer radius of each of the villages. The villages are shown here in white on this map on the right, but I didn't label them for anonymity. And as you can imagine, though, the land covers of each are quite different. So for example, let's compare the village with the lowest prevalence of malaria on the left to the village with the highest prevalence of malaria on the right. What immediately jumps out to me is the dominance of croplands for the village with low malaria, but dominance of natural and managed forests for the highest malaria village. It turns out the land use data from the surveys and the land cover data from the satellite map both tell different parts of the same story. What I found is that a person that merely lives in close proximity to a forest is more likely to have malaria, regardless of if they actually reported spending time in the forest or not. The reverse, though, is true for farming. Persons that live in villages surrounded by large areas of croplands are less likely to have malaria unless they are specifically spending a lot of time at a farm. I corroborated these findings by testing the relationship for a subsample of the population that did not claim to visit any of the land uses that we had in our survey. I found similar likelihoods of malaria for this subpopulation, further emphasizing that simply living near a forest increased the likelihood of an individual having malaria, even if they did not specifically spend time in the forest outside of their home. Overall, the odds of a person having malaria increased by a factor of 1.96 per 1 square kilometer increase in forest cover surrounding their primary village of residence. I thought that the relationship between forests and malaria was really interesting, especially because a recent study found that forested landscapes in Myanmar are rapidly changing, with the country losing over 2 million hectares of forest between 2002 and 2014. And malaria studies in other regions of the world have found links between forest cover change and malaria. So I wondered if the same was true for Myanmar. On Township is a good case study for this because, as you can see from these animations, rapid forest changes have been occurring in On since 2001. Previous research has shown that logging workers in a different region of Myanmar were at increased risk of contracting malaria, but otherwise little work has been done in this particular region. When I used deforestation as my variable of interest in my logistic regression model, I originally found very, very strong associations, which was super like, woo, deforestation is driving malaria in Myanmar. Oh my gosh. But wait, I shouldn't get that excited because it turns out that the relationship that I found was really driven by a single village in my sample, Village C, which experienced the highest malaria prevalence and also the highest deforestation by a very, very wide margin in comparison to the other villages. When I conducted a sensitivity analysis and removed Village C, no associations between malaria and deforestation were found for this region. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't necessarily mean that an association doesn't exist, but it does mean that more evidence is needed before I can draw an official conclusion here. When the findings of the work I've presented so far are considered together, one worrying conclusion is that malaria prevalence in On Township may be very significant in the most marginalized and isolated villages. My village mapping work found that remote settlements in On extend well east of those identified by the best available village map created by the Myanmar Information Management Unit, and it's shown here in the blue and the magenta colors. While comparing their point data to my raster data is absolutely not cartographically sound, when I zoom in, you can see that my map, shown in yellow, captures many areas that were previously unmapped in their village mapping. Back of the envelope calculations of these newly identified villages indicate that forests could make up to 73% of the land covers immediately surrounding these previously unidentified settlements. Assuming that the relationship between forest cover and malaria extends into the eastern areas of On Township, it is likely that significant malaria reservoirs could be found among the populations living there. This estimate is particularly concerning given the difficulty inherent in reaching those isolated settlements to provide medical care and other preventative measures. So now I'm going to share with you a little bit of what I am currently working on. I won't take too much longer on this, but essentially now that I know where people live and how that impacts their exposure to malaria, I wanted to know more about what they do. When I control for environmental factors about where they live, especially the forest cover surrounding their village, what individual activities that they engage in contribute to their malaria risk. And why is that so important to know, their activities? Well, firstly, while malaria overall has dropped significantly in Myanmar since 2012, like I said earlier, progress has stalled. We're so close to eliminating malaria, but these remaining cases are proving exceedingly tricky to detect and eliminate. For this work, I again used a data set collected by the Duke and Myanmar teams, but this new data set was collected 2 years after the previous data set and for 5 different villages. Unfortunately, the second round of data collection found very similar rates of asymptomatic malaria infections. It is also important to know what activities people engage in that increase their malaria risk, because the current malaria elimination strategies implemented by the Myanmar National Plan for Malaria Elimination focus on prevention from within the home, such as indoor residual spraying for mosquitoes and increasing the use of bed nets. While these measures have definitely contributed significantly to the drop in malaria cases across the country, as we just saw within On Township, malaria prevalence has remained steady now in recent years. It is then reasonable to assume that this remaining malaria pool might not be suitably eliminated through just these home-centric strategies. So this time around, we needed much more detail than before. The 2018 data collection included a survey that asked about more diverse land use activities, in addition to the frequency and duration that people engaged in those activities. It also asked about other relevant factors, such as primary occupation, symptoms, and bed net usage. Another key component of this particular study was that, based on my previous findings, I controlled for natural forest cover around a village in all of my models. So what I found that increased the likelihood of an individual having malaria were 3 factors. Firstly, if the respondent reported that their primary occupation was in the logging or plantation industry, they were more likely to have malaria. Not really a big surprise there. If they had any sort of outdoor job, that also increased their likelihood of malaria. And also if they engaged in forest chores, which includes activities like hunting or collecting firewood. This last one, the forest chores, is particularly concerning because almost half of our study population reported conducting forest chores at least once a month for several hours. I also found that many activities were not associated with malaria, including farming, being a student, and conducting chores near the water. Claiming to be a dependent was the only factor I found that was associated with a lowering of malaria occurrence. Participants claiming dependent status ranged across age groups, but the primary importance of this finding is that these are people who spend comparatively more time in their homes or in their village of primary residence as compared to working participants. So this work so far is showing that while the land use practices vary really widely within the study population, it's clear that the current reservoir of malaria remaining in On Township is held by people who are exposed to malaria through their land use behaviors outside of their homes. So while the home-centric malaria prevention strategies currently practiced in Myanmar have been incredibly successful, my results indicate that in order to drive out those last few malaria cases, the prevention paradigm should consider shifting to focus also on decreasing risk for people where they work or where they spend time outside of their homes, especially if that time is spent in a forested landscape. So to wrap up my presentation today, I've used an interdisciplinary approach to explore and characterize malaria exposure in On Township by pulling from the fields of geography, public health, epidemiology, social science, biomedical science, computer science, and statistics. My research harnessed the capabilities of satellite remote sensing and geospatial data to quantify and assess malaria exposure as a function of where people live, while epidemiology methodologies were crucial to contextualizing the broad observed patterns of landscape use and linking those to malaria occurrence. While incorporating interdisciplinary techniques was challenging, especially in regards to fusing disparate data sets, which were often mismatched temporally and spatially, it overall allowed for a better understanding of malaria exposure in On Township. I used to think of myself as a physical quantitative scientist and was nervous to incorporate social data into my work. But geohealth problems are too big and too multifaceted to be solved by single disciplinarians. Being willing to embrace interdisciplinary science and multidisciplinary collaborators is the best advice that I ever got and that I can give to anyone else in the geohealth field. And speaking of collaborators, I have some absolutely wonderful ones, and here they all are. And thank you, everyone, so much for listening today, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoffman Hall. We do have several questions. I want to remind everyone, if you joined a little bit later, if you find the participant in your chat whose name is Ask Questions Here, your question will be categorized and we will get to as many of those as we can in the time we have left. So I'll start off with one question that we have is, so you mentioned that your research is involving satellite imagery combined with machine learning in order to address specifically in your study area of Myanmar, Southeast Asia. To your knowledge, or do you think that your sort of like methods could be applied in regular surveillance or in other places in the world where targeted malaria eradication is also a similar goal?
I definitely think they could. When, in all of my research, while yes, I was using, like, Myanmar was my primary area, and as a geographer, I have to say that no two areas are exactly the same. But overall, I think that the methodologies that I used and that I pulled from can definitely be applicable much more broadly. Particularly the machine learning portion that I was talking about first. The goal of that particular methodology was really to create something that can be used, particularly in data poor regions. If you're working, somewhere like the United States, we have an entire agency dedicated to counting the citizens of this country, like the US Census Bureau. They do that. They count everybody every 10 years. We have so much very high resolution spatial imagery of, most places here in the US. Whereas when you're working in some of these countries that are a little bit more data poor, it can be more difficult to locate where people are, especially the most marginalized people that need access to these services, like malaria prevention, for example. So I think that you always have to be cautious and be very familiar with your particular study area. For example, knowing about the slash and burn agriculture in Myanmar was really key to us being able to identify where the villages in Myanmar were for that first part of my work. But there's some sort of tell like that for every location. It's just being aware and trying to figure out what is that particular tell for your location that will allow you to kind of be successful in that way.
Thanks for that insight. So the next question we have, so someone mentions that, Landsat makes a lot of sense as you explained in your work. I guess if you had, free available access to the high resolution, high frequency commercial data, what more do you think you would be able to do, maybe like a future direction or something that you might have done differently given that data set?
Oh, yeah, that is, whew, if you have that, call me. That would be wonderful. And I actually have redone my first analysis actually using Sentinel. So Sentinel is 10-meter spatial resolution, which is, the order like 3 times better than the Landsat spatial resolution of 30 meters. And while it worked, and I think it did help with the accuracy of my map, being able to use Sentinel as opposed to Landsat, the computational expense was dramatically increased. Everything took a lot longer. I had to be a lot more like savvy with parallel processing and things like that. But with that said, I do know of some work that's being done on very high resolution data, even higher than Sentinel, like we're talking like sub-meter resolution data by teams at Google, at Facebook. And there are some really exciting like settlement mapping projects that are coming out of those companies and of some, like I'm thinking the PopGrid Collective, if you guys have ever heard of them. They do a lot of really awesome work in this area too. Columbia University is doing a lot of awesome work in that area. And there certainly have been advances in using very high resolution to do this sort of stuff. When I was doing it, the goal was for it to be something that could hypothetically be replicated by someone without access to major computing power. I will say that when you're running the algorithms that I designed on a single desktop, they take a long time. But the algorithm that I made was able to eventually run on a single desktop. So kind of the goal was to do it with all publicly available data, mostly because I didn't have access to anything else, but with all publicly available data so that it could be replicated by someone without the resources of Facebook or without the resources of Google. But there is really exciting stuff being done on their end.
Awesome. Thanks for that. One question that I think a lot of people have, not only working in, Southeast Asia, specifically townships or just Myanmar in general, but do you have any tips or advice or just your general experience with building these relationships with either partners on the ground or, since it's, remote sensing is a large part of geography, like studying places where you either don't have access to? You mentioned some of the, circumstances that prevented a lot of either being there in person or reaching out to collaborators. So do you have any advice for having, developing that relationship, or if you are interested, if you are sitting in like College Park, Maryland, but you're interested in researching a different place and you can't get there, how you overcome some of those obstacles of not being able to be on the ground?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and I'm really glad people brought that up. I do wish that I had a better answer for it. I think particularly remote sensing scientists in particular, because we have this ability and almost this power to view other places of the world without physically being there. I think that we, in particular, as a remote sensing community, have to be really careful about what we do with that data and how we use it. Like I said, when I was mapping the settlements of where people lived, one of the big keys was identifying that slash and burn agriculture. And unless someone from my team had physically been there to see that, I wouldn't have known that. It possibly is published somewhere that that's a common practice there, but I wasn't able to actually find like a way to like cite that, for example. So I do think it's incredibly important to establish these relationships like in country, and also to listen to the people that are actually like living in this area. And, a lot of this work that I did was conducted when I was a graduate student. So it's very much, a lot of it is kind of driven by my advisor, who is incredible and was out in Myanmar for 3 months of every year, on the back of a motorcycle, like riding through these very small villages in On Township. And she really took the time to listen to the community while she was there and to actually engage with them and ask them, like, these are the things that we're seeing on the satellite data. Like, does that sound like, are we on the right track? Like, do you have any thoughts as to what we're researching? Do you have any answers? If we ask these questions to you right now, what are you thinking about them? And I think getting to that relationship is the hardest part. And I unfortunately don't have great advice on how to get it established in the first place. I got really lucky that I met a researcher I met a researcher from Duke that was from Myanmar. And so she had very close ties with people over there. And that's kind of the best advice I can give for getting a relationship like that established. But at least once you get it established, I just want to remind everyone that it's so, so important, especially as remote sensing scientists, to not lose sight of the fact that what we're viewing on these satellite images, there's real people down there that are really living in these things that we're mapping and that we're studying and that we're looking at.
Awesome. Thanks for that insight again, Amanda. So one question that, and I don't have the slide number for it, but someone has a more, I guess, like specific question about the research. So in the slide talking about land use activities and malaria risk, how are you able to separate, quote, having an outdoor job with increased risk and, quote, farming with no association?
Yeah. So that's a good question. We really tried to look at each particular basically survey question individually. So we didn't do a lot of, every model controlled for things like age, sex, things like that. But we didn't really get into a lot of multivariate modeling where we would like combine factors like having an outdoor job with farming. It was more looking at every variable individually to see if the odds ratios were significant or not. But that's a really good question.
Great, thanks. If whoever asked that question, if you have a follow-up, you can please put it up in the chat.
Oh yeah, and there's another thing that we looked at too that I didn't have time to talk about, but one of the most interesting things about our survey results is just, people don't just do one thing like that. Nobody, just does one thing. And so one of the things that we kind of tried to account for was the various land uses that people engaged in. Like we had some participants that said that they had a job in the logging industry, but they also did farming like every week for multiple hours a day, and that they also conducted forest chores, and they also went and did water chores, and they also worked in a mine. Like we had participants that answered various land use activities. Like there was not a single person that was like, I'm only a farmer and that's the only thing I do. And so I actually did develop a land use index basically that I didn't share here today, of course, but it basically was meant to account for those sort of interactions between multiple land uses. And one of the things that we certainly found was that the more diverse and varied your land use activities are, the more likely you are to have malaria. People with very high land use index scores tended to be those that were the most likely to have malaria infection.
Great, thanks. So another question we have about, so you use remote sensing and so images from satellites in the region. And so is your data incorporated into a census? Or is this an effort that isn't?
Did you say incorporated into a census?
Yeah, so I guess is this official data, I guess, submitted to be used by different agencies that are on the ground?
Gotcha. So we didn't, so the year that we actually made the land use map for was the year 2016. So at this point, it was mostly helpful for us in terms of, because our malaria data was from 2016 too, so that's why we did the land use map for 2016. If we were going to sort of operationalize it and provide it to the census agency in Myanmar, for example, we would have to update it a lot more frequently, do at least one different run a year. And we haven't done that. I think it's a great idea. I don't know if it's possible right now, just with like the current sort of climate that's going on. At the time when that particular paper was published, the census in Myanmar was it wasn't like it's not like here where we do it every 10 years. It was more of, I think the previous census before the 2014 census was done in 1974. So they don't have like a consistent do it every certain amount of years, basically. But that's a great idea.
Thanks. So another question, just for, since we're like early career committee, do you have like, was Geohealth like always your set discipline that you wanted to get into from undergrad, maybe grad school or anything like that? Or did you sort of, maybe I guess thinking of in like terms of like AGU terms, like were you more of like global environmental change and then switched over to Geohealth, or were you hydrology? I guess a little bit more about your path, since we're more targeted for like early career folks.
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, what remote sensing scientist doesn't start in global environmental change? I mean, that's the first thing we all pick when we join AGU. But I kind of came to Geohealth probably a little later than I would have liked to. I wish I would have been here a lot longer. But actually, if there's anyone here that is still working, I know there's a couple at least, that's still working on your PhD. Fun fact about me, this is actually my second dissertation topic. My very first dissertation topic failed entirely. I had a 2-year experiment of 500 red oak seedlings that were growing in a greenhouse, and there was like a catastrophic failure, and after 2 years I had absolutely no data that was actually workable. So this research that I've been working on was something that I came to after like a catastrophic failure of my original research topic. I was going to look at a oak pathogen. So it didn't seem like a complete sort of 180 to instead focus on a human pathogen. And by the time that sort of epic failure happened, I was really interested sort of like in pathogen dynamics, but I like trees. I like the forest. I'm a remote sensing scientist and I love being able to map forest cover and things like that. But the ability to use the skills that I had to help actual people was extremely appealing. And I think that's why I ultimately ended up in Geohealth, because the problems that we work on have such direct and measurable impact on communities and on the people that we work for, basically. I consider myself as working like for the global elimination of malaria. And I think that that's something that's particularly special about the geohealth field, no matter which, I know geohealth is really broad. But yeah, I definitely came to it a little bit later than I would have liked to, but I'm sticking with it now. Like geohealth is stuck with me. I'm not going anywhere else.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that insight. I think like falling forward is always a good good way to describe.
For sure. And I fell very hard.
Thanks for that. So I guess anyway, if anyone, I see more questions perhaps are coming in, but I guess more on like your research. You'd mentioned like a few like future directions and what you would do if you had unlimited high resolution spatial data. I guess would you like where do you think like you would want to go next, either just like related to like what you're doing now or just like more geohealth like broadly, again for folks who are here early career who are trying to find their footing, like where do you see, is it COVID related research seeing popping up, is it more targeted malaria, machine learning algorithms, AI, or just like as your experience being further into the geohealth field, where do you see research gaps or directions just overall?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think have a slide. Oh yeah, so this is an old slide. I didn't edit it, sorry, but these are actually things that I had thought about and things that I would want to do in the future. One of the big sort of gaps, at least in the research that like I've been doing, is that I don't incorporate any actual mosquito data. So I have malaria data, I have land cover data, I have people data. The last sort of piece there is that mosquito data. And so I would love to work with someone that, you know, an entomologist, and get them involved on, you know, something like this, and trying to figure out more, because one of the big questions that my research wasn't able to answer was that deforestation question. And I know, for example, like in the Amazon, like there's this sort of like negative feedback loop where like increased deforestation like causes more malaria because more people are out there, but then like the reduction of the forest can maybe sometimes, I know it's kind of confusing in the Amazon. And so I would love to know more about how exactly these mosquito species are interacting with the land cover. When a forest is cleared, like what is the sort of reestablishment time of that particular population of mosquitoes coming back? I would love to do more things like that. I would really, really love to do participatory mapping, like with the actual communities, and like ask them, you know, where in your village, like, do you think that you're most at risk of contracting malaria? Like I would like just that, start with that question and then kind of go from there. I think that there's some really interesting work being done in that field. Unfortunately for me, I don't know what the situation in my particular study area is going to evolve into, and if I will be able to go to the country anytime soon. But that is definitely, those are just some of sort of the future directions and future things that I think that I would like to do. I hope though, I hope that I'm not studying malaria forever. Like I know it's lofty, but I hope that we eliminate it globally. Like I hope it's gone. And I hope that my research agenda just totally falls apart because it's been dedicated to malaria and that malaria is gone. Maybe that's, you know, a little naive, but that would be best case scenario. And in which case, yeah, I would look at all sorts of interesting things. I think that there is, I was actually just talking to a new PhD student the other day about using satellite Earth observations for another epidemiological problem that had to do with like pesticides and things. And I think that there are a lot of ways that Earth observations can be helpful. They're not a cure-all. They're not going to, you know, they can't do everything. Like I'm hyper aware of all the things they cannot do. But I do think that there is a really valuable space for them in a lot of different scientific fields, especially in geohealth.
Awesome. We're 5 minutes away from the hour, so I want to just thank you, Dr. Amanda Hoffman, for being with us today, for letting us know about your research, all the exciting things that you're doing, a little bit about your like path and how you got here, how you ended up falling into geohealth. We really appreciate all of your insight and your time. And so with that, I'm going to do some just brief concluding remarks just to wrap up today here. I'll just share. So again, thank you again for all of your time and answering everyone's questions. If you didn't get your question answered, I think Dr. Hoffman put her email up. And so I just want to say that this is part of a round monthly webinar series with early career scientists, as well as professional development. We had previously had to submit a session to AGU, which is due next week. And then in the chat should be shared this webinar email form if you want to join us for more. And then also in the larger umbrella of things, we are a committee that's part of the Geohealth section of the larger American Geophysical Union. So this webinar is free and open to everyone, and we love having everyone here. But if you want to join AGU and join us hybrid, either online or in person in New Orleans in the fall, again, the chat will have the link to join, and the student rate is really, really reasonable. So we can get a lot of early career researchers together and we can all network and learn from each other. So with that, I want to again thank you for all the participants. Thank you, Dr. Hoffman for being here. And we will see you all at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. I appreciate it.